All right, we're now recording. We're now live. So now I'll turn the floor over to Victoria. Thank you very much for coming.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for putting this on. My name is Vicky. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a senior advisor on Michelle's campaign and very involved in the organizing side of things. I am also a very proud UMass Boston alum, and I wore my Beacon Be the Difference t-shirt for the for the event to come say hi to you all. And there are multiple people on the call that I know, which is awesome. So hello, and very excited. But yeah, so tonight there is just as overlapping with the event, as Nick mentioned, there's a town hall on combating anti-API racism, and so Michelle is there at the moment, but is really excited to be joining, and she'll be here soon. And so while we wait for her to join, I just wanted to say a little bit about ways to get involved with the campaign. Obviously, I don't want to assume that, obviously there are lots of undecided voters in the room, so I don't want to assume that everyone's already made their decision, but just wanted to say a few words about why I think Michelle should be our next mayor, and how you can get involved either now if you want to, or later if you decide that she's your candidate. I had been hoping that Michelle would run for a long time. As you may know, there was a long period where everyone was sort of talking about whether she was going to run, and then she finally announced her campaign, which was super exciting. One of the things that I'm most excited about as it relates to Michelle's candidacy is that she has a really long and strong track record of delivering on her priorities. And that's important for any office. But I think it's especially important when you're running for mayor. It's an executive job. It's about executing and, getting things done. And, one of the things that we see from her time on the city council is that, she's not just sort of saying we need to do things and like tweeting or whatever about how we need to do things, but she's passed the ordinances. She's, actually like crafted the policies to make these things real. And even, recently since the campaign started, she already, like, this is all post-campaign. She wrote, passed, and basically shepherded through legislation that would make all city forms gender inclusive, because non-binary folks were going and trying to get married at City Hall and being faced with non-inclusive forms in the year 2021, right? And so she didn't just like go and tweet about how terrible this was, but actually wrote and passed legislation to fix it that has passed the council already. So that's just one of many examples. Anyway, what I want to talk about is ways for folks to get involved. So on the internship and fellowship front, we do anticipate running paid internships throughout the summer, and hopefully all of the fall, because we will make it to the final election and Michelle will be elected as our next mayor. But in any case, the fall we will plan a little bit closer to the date. I'll put the link to our jobs page in the chat. And so that's where any openings will come up, whether they are paid internships, organizer positions, or whatever it may be. And also just wanted to say a little bit about volunteering. So this is a local campaign, and every local campaign is won by talking to voters individually about what matters to them. You don't have to be, from Boston or even live in Boston to volunteer, right? Anyone can volunteer. Some of what we're doing right now is we are phone banking. Right now it's 4 nights a week, but it'll soon be every day. If you want to make calls on your own schedule, that's also something we can arrange. Most of the voters we're talking to right now are undecided, but talking to them early is a really important way to win elections. People want to feel heard. We want to know what matters to them. If they're already on board, and there are tons of people out there who are already on board, we want to know that as soon as possible. So we phone bank Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 5 to 7. We phone bank on Tuesdays from 6 to 8. And we will, again, soon be phone banking like basically every single day. So I'll put a link in the chat to sign up for that as well. Another thing I want to plug is signature gathering. We, all candidates who are running for mayor have to get 3,000 certified signatures on their nomination papers. And so when we get those nomination papers on April 27th, there will be a really intense sort of all hands on deck effort to get signatures from as many registered voters in Boston as possible. So I'll put a link in the chat to sign up for that as well, if that's something that you want to do. We also, throughout the city, are building neighborhood teams, doing literature drops. We will at some point be doing socially distant and safe canvassing, although that's of course completely optional and not something that everyone has to do or can do. And also, I run our digital organizing program. So if you'd like to get involved with the process of engaging with all these people on Twitter who are constantly talking about how excited they are about Michelle's campaign, we have a team of people who are keeping track of that and responding to folks and helping to get them involved. And then the last thing I want to pitch is our relational organizing program. So relational organizing is something that became more popular, especially after Ed Markey was reelected last year. Anyone on his team, if you ask them, how did Ed Markey win? Like the first thing out of their mouth is going to be relational organizing, right? And so what that is based on is like very simple principles that, people are more likely to answer your call if they know you. They're more likely to tell you what they really think if they know you. So relational organizing is about talking to your friends and your family and asking them who they're supporting and talking to them about why you're supporting your candidate, working with us to keep track of that the same way that we keep track of it when you go knock on someone's door. So I'm going to put my email in the chat. I'm going to put all these links in the chat that I've referenced while I'm talking. And I would be very happy to answer any questions. I know that we have not yet gotten to answer all of your questions about policies and all of the things that Michelle is going to speak to. But while we wait for her to join us, if you do have any questions, I would be very, very happy to answer them.
All right, awesome. If anyone has any questions about getting involved with the campaign or anything that Victoria just told us about, feel free to raise your hand and I will call on you and then unmute you. Well, one thing that I did think of while I was listening to you talk is we'd love to send out some of these opportunities to our membership and through our distro list and everything. And yeah, so obviously we can't endorse or anything. We can't show any favoritism in any of the sorts of campaigns being a College Democrats chapter. But we love sending out internship and campaign opportunities. So I will take all these links and everything, and after our meeting today, when I'm sending out the video, when I'm posting the video, I'll make sure to send out and post all this information as well. So if any of you missed any of this while you are working on, or while she was talking today, you'll see it right in the email that I'll send out probably tomorrow. I think I'll send it out tomorrow instead of Sunday because we have such an exciting event for today. Anyone else have any specific questions on that?
And can I also, sorry, I also just wanted to introduce Daniela. who is one of our amazing interns who's been with us since the fall, actually. So she just is going to speak a little bit about other ways to get involved, like as a campus. So if that's okay, Nick, is it all
Oh,
right?
that's fantastic. I'd love to hear.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
Thanks, Vicky. Hi, I'm Daniela. Like Vicky said, I'm a fellow on the campaign. I've been working with the campaign for a while. One of the big things we're trying to do right now is get campus groups organized, and we would love to start a essentially UMass Boston for Wu group. I've been in contact with a couple students, and we are trying to get our first big item we want to do is to plan a bigger meeting where we can all just chat about ideas we have, and start to get some events planned. What we want to do with that is a lot of the things Vicky was talking about, doing phone banks, relational organizing, more events like this where we're maybe collaborating with other campus groups to get more events happening. The signatures, getting signatures for Michelle's nomination is another big item. But I'm going to put an email you can send. You can contact Mia if you're interested in joining this group, and we can chat and we can get that going, because we're at the very beginning stages of that. Another thing I want to say is Vicky mentioned that we do our Monday, Wednesday, Friday phone banks. If anyone is interested in running phone banks, let me know about that, because I can train you to do that, where you'll go on and you'll give a training and then you'll help people as they make phone banks. If anyone has any interest in that, you can also contact me about that. So that's all I have.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And did you put your email in the chat? I don't know if it popped up.
Yeah, I'm going to do it now.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. And I will make sure to include all that information in the email as well. Awesome. Anyone else have any questions for the campaigns today about how you can get involved, or even just general questions about campaigning in general? These people are certainly experts on that issue.
Yes. Sorry. Should I have raised my hand first, Nick?
Nah, you good, Isabella.
All right. Anyways, I do have a question for Victoria and Daniela. So how would you advise people who want to get involved on the Michelle Wu campaign?
Yeah, so I'm happy to speak to that. Daniela, please feel free to jump in. But I think I think the first thing is, like, we're very thankful for any time that people are willing to give the campaign. In terms of actual activities, there are some sort of bread and butter activities that are the heartbeat of any local campaign. They are calling voters, knocking on doors, relational organizing. But as Danielle has alluded to, there's a lot of coordination to make those things happen. So it's not like that's literally all you're doing, but those are like the central goals. And so maybe I'll let Daniela speak to like what other student groups have done, or like what some of the first steps for example, a UMB group would be. Yeah, so Daniela, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. So I would say, if you personally are interested in getting involved, sign up right away for all of the volunteer events that we have on the website. We have plenty of opportunities for, the lit drops and the phone banking. But then from there, I think we're at the beginning stages of forming these college groups, but I think that comes down to all of you. If you're interested in advocating for Michelle from your campus, you can take a leadership role in this group right now and start planning events and strategies that you think would be best to do from your campus. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. There's not just one way that we can do this. It can really be catered to what students from your school would be interested in. But if you come, I'm Michelle. If you let me know, we can plan a meeting and we can just chat about what some of these ideas are. A lot of them have already been said, but it really comes down to what you are interested in and what your strengths are.
Okay, thank you guys.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. And thank you, Isabella, for your awesome question. Thank you, Victoria and Daniela, for giving us so much information on how we can get involved with this campaign. And now I see that Councilor Wu has joined us. Thank you so much for coming today. Before I pass the floor over to Councilor Wu, I'll just give you guys a quick rundown on how this event's going to go today. So first, we're going to have Councilor Wu introduce herself, give a little bit of background, and tell us a bit about her campaign. Just give her best elevator pitch, so to speak, in marketing. And then we'll launch into our Q&A session. And for that Q&A session, we've got a couple pre-submitted questions from groups and awesome people on campus. So for those questions, I will just call on you and ask you to talk about your question. So yeah, that's how that'll go. After we get through those pre-submitted questions, we'll go to just the general questions. So if you've got a general question, either while Michelle's talking, or I'm sorry, Councilor Wu, while Councilor Wu's talking, if you can just send me a quick message in the direct message function in the chat, or raise your hand if you're having trouble getting to that direct message function. And yeah, I'll call on you once I see that up. Thank you guys so much. Thank you everyone for coming to this event. It means a lot to me to see all these great names and faces that I recognize, and a lot that I don't recognize too. So we must have got the word out to a lot of people. All right, well, without further ado, the moment you've all been waiting for, I'll pass the floor over to Councilor Wu. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Daniela, Vicky. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here tonight. I'm really excited to see so many people here, and I'm going to try to keep my talking portion short so that we can have more Q&A and dialogues. Most of all, I'd love to really hear what's on your minds and what you think I should be thinking about, and what our plans for the city should include. So I think there's a couple things that you need to know about me that really have shaped me into the person that I am. First is that I never, ever expected to run for office. I'm the daughter of immigrants. The thought never once crossed my mind growing up. I never saw anyone who looked like me in politics or positions of leadership. Spent my childhood in some ways really understanding and helping navigate so many of the barriers that families face in their city, particularly families of color, particularly immigrant families with language barriers. And we never talked about politics at the dinner table. I didn't realize until much later in my life that it wasn't that my parents didn't care about what was happening in the world or weren't following the news. But in my family's history, in our family tree over multiple generations, politics wasn't always associated with things that you wanted to be involved in. I'm the daughter of immigrants, but my parents themselves were also children of immigrants, as both sets of my grandparents were from mainland China, but fled during the Civil War to the island of Taiwan. And so politics was famine, politics was corruption and fear and danger. And so I was told, like my siblings were by my parents, when you grow up, get a job that pays you a lot, will keep you out of trouble, that will be stable and you don't have to worry about it. And so I'm just so excited to see you all here, because when I was in college, I never found my way to political events, and certainly wasn't thinking about how to get involved in public service and government and politics. It was really in some ways unexpected. I had just graduated from Harvard, was working downtown and, making money, earning my keep, renting an apartment and walking to work. And then I got one of those phone calls that none of us ever wants to get from home. There's something very wrong and you have to come home now. When I flew back to where my family was, near Chicago, we realized that my mom was in the midst of a mental health crisis. She wasn't eating, wasn't sleeping, was self-medicating with alcohol for a while. wasn't able to take care of her own health, much less take care of my two sisters who were still at home. And so almost overnight, I found myself at the age of 22 raising two younger sisters who were 10 and 16, becoming caregiver for my mom, and just trying to figure out a way to survive. As someone who had never thought about politics, never thought about government, all of a sudden it felt like I was dealing with government everywhere I looked, and in incredibly stressful situations. Trying to get my mom health care with someone who could speak her language that our insurance would cover, trying to get my sisters the supports they needed in school, given the trauma that was happening at home, trying to open a small family business to keep us going, and feeling like it was one hoop after another that we had to jump through. And still it was incredibly difficult. And so I became fed up, right? My whole life, I had known what it felt like to be translating for my parents. And I applied to law school because I felt like I needed to learn another language about how to translate all of these incredibly stressful issues of the law. So I came back to Boston, this time brought my family with me, and my mom was getting care in Boston. My sisters were in school. I was trying to go to law school. And this city created the pathway for my family to be able to find stability, find health, find opportunity. And so I'm not originally from Boston. I wasn't lucky enough to be born here. My parents weren't lucky enough to be born in the United States. And so it matters to me that we're building a city that is welcoming to everyone. It matters to me that every single family gets to connect with the incredible resources that are here. So Boston's really given me everything that I cherish in my life. The healthcare that really has stabilized my mom, the schools that my sisters have graduated from, this home that we get to live in Rosendale, a 2-family home where I'm upstairs with my husband and my 2 sons who are 3 and 6. And my mom lives downstairs, and she still has her up and down days, but I can send her grandsons down to keep her occupied and for her to keep them entertained. And it's just in some ways the most stable situation that our family could ever have. It's a situation that is getting farther and farther out of reach for Bostonians, of being supported with multi-generational living situations and housing that you can afford, and the chance to be able to find your way to go to great schools. We are a city of so many resources, but where the gaps are so big and the inequities by race, by class, by geography, have been widened through this pandemic. And so my charge for Boston, right, what I've been pushing for 8 years on the council and now in my campaign for mayor, is to break down the silos and connect our communities to each other, connect every community to government as a platform for activism. We need to be a city where we're exercising bold, urgent leadership to make Boston a city for everyone. And I believe that this moment is more important than ever for all of our voices to be part of doing that. So I was the first candidate to announce for mayor back in September. It was a very different situation then. Everyone widely expected Mayor Walsh to run for re-election, and it was seen as an almost impossible task of challenging an incumbent mayor. But so many of the fights that we've taken on the council and all the legislation and all the advances that we've made, we were told was impossible to begin with as well. And every time I've seen, especially in Boston, when you build a coalition, when you make room for everyone to be at the table, when you take City Hall and governing out of City Hall and get into the community, that's when everything becomes possible. So that's what we've been doing from day one. We are now 6 months away from the preliminary election in Boston. Just in case it's helpful for anyone to understand the election process, as many candidates as can collect enough signatures will be on the ballot. September 14th is a new recommended election day. And the top 2 vote getters in September, regardless of your political party, will go on to the final election November 2nd. And so we need your help. We need your help as we're trying to build our organization in every community, trying to put out all of our policy plans, and trying to make it clear that it's not just important for people to vote because city government matters in your life in really important ways. But we need to change who matters to city government and make sure that everybody is seen and heard and has a role. So I'm really grateful for your time today, and can't wait to hear what's on your mind.
Thank you so much, Counselor, for that wonderful explanation of really who you are, and that backstory really touches, I know personally a lot of our hearts and a lot of the personal stories at a school like UMass Boston. It's such a diverse, wonderful school, and probably the best decision I've made my entire life. Short of proposing to my fiance, of course. But all right, so we've got some really awesome questions that were pre-submitted by a couple different groups and people on campus. So first, I am going to pass the floor to someone who has done so much awesome, incredible activism on campus. Every time she unmutes her mic on one of these meetings, I am sitting on the edge of my seat because she always is in tune with the most important things. And she's asking a question about probably the most important issue in UMass Boston's local community right now. So without further ado, I would like to open the floor to Isabel DePina to ask her question.
Hi, my name is Isabel DePina. I'm a student organizer for Public Higher Education Network in Massachusetts and an active president. So my question is, as you know, UMass is leasing a former Expo Center land that Cordia is proposing to develop as Dorchester Bay City, which they are claiming will be another Kendall Square. Like Kendall Square, Dorchester Bay City will raise rents and living costs among the many negative impacts it will have on Dorchester communities of color and other working class residents. If you are elected mayor of Boston, what will you do to prevent this kind of gentrification and displacement of working class communities? How would you assure that development in Boston is driven by the needs and voice of communities of color instead of the developed interests that drive it now?
Thank you so much for all of your leadership and advocacy. Thank you so much for raising this. I was just on Morrissey Boulevard with my team not too many months ago. We came out at high tide on the day that the tide was lining up with the moon cycles in the right way, where unfortunately this happens all too often. The water came right up over the edge of the street and flooded the entire way, certain sections of Morrissey Boulevard. And so not only is it extremely alarming and unacceptable that we have seen so many families displaced from Boston and the pandemic making everything worse, we are continuing to ignore the dangers of climate change and flooding that will just add to pressures that we're seeing, because the residents who can least afford to pay for flooding insurance and all the protections, it just adds to that burden. So this is an issue that I've been talking about for a very long time. The underlying problem, I believe, is that we don't have rules that govern across the board. Basically, whenever developers come in, anything goes, because there's the last time the city of Boston comprehensively looked at what we needed in every neighborhood and how that fits together and codified that into our zoning code, which is supposed to be the blueprint for how we decide what's allowed to go where, how high, where do we keep as open space, where do we, and then build affordability into that. The last time we did that as a city was 1965. Right? So we're in a very different place in 2021. We are a city that has had a population boom over the last year. You look at all the cranes, especially downtown and even all through the neighborhoods. But as the number of people living here has gone up, the number of kids living in Boston has actually gone down. And it's because families are being priced out of the city. Families are being pushed out. And we need to make sure that development that comes here is a tool to be able to keep people in Boston and stabilize our communities and create opportunity rather than make it worse. So fundamentally, we need to get back to that underlying planning process. We need to abolish the agency, the BPD, Boston Planning and Development Agency, that is a structure from the 1950s and 60s that was designed to bring in development at the expense of hearing from community and building consensus and understanding how the pieces fit together. So when it comes to our climate vulnerability, housing affordability, transportation access, we're missing the boat on so many ways in development. And so we need to get to a place where we're structurally changing how we think about development, so it doesn't become a battle and a negotiation with every parcel where the people with the most resources have the ability to push back, and then everyone else just has to deal with it or get pushed out altogether. So I don't know if Vicky, if you could help put in the chat our link to our plan around the BPDA. We want to make sure that there's more housing that people can afford that comes to the city. We want to make sure that we're making connections around transportation, infrastructure, and housing. We do need to have more housing in the city that is affordable to our residents. And we need to make sure that any development that comes through Boston is stabilizing our communities. I will note also that a big thing just happened on the council this last year. My colleague Lydia Edwards was leading the charge for a zoning amendment that would require fair housing to be part of the process as well. So anytime someone wants to develop, they have to affirmatively look at what the displacement risk is and put in place a plan to counter that. It's certainly not going to be perfect. The developers aren't going to get it right on their own, but to have that rule in place means that we are getting much closer to the point where we can think about all the impacts of development, not just how high and what the profit is, but how does this really fit in with what the community needs?
Thank you, but I like the word abolish. Let's abolish everything.
Thank you so much for that awesome response, using that to talk about what is such an important part of your campaign. And thank you, Isabel, for that great question. As soon as I saw that pop into my email, I got quite excited to see that one. All right, so our next question is going to come from a very important person on campus, our student body president, Jean Ray. Jean Ray is awesome. He handles so many different things on campus, and he's done such a great job even with all the challenges that we've seen. So without further ado, I will allow Jean Ray to ask his question.
Thanks, Nick. Just a quick shout out to Nick and the UMass Boston Dems organization for organizing this event. It's amazing and excited to meet Councilor Wu for the first time. Also, just quick shout out to Vice President Jerry, who's also here with me. I couldn't have done a lot of the work that we've accomplished together without her. So, but again, Councilor Wu, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'll just jump. I have a couple of questions. I also want to be mindful of time as well. The first one being, especially this past year, there have been a lot of racial issues that have taken the forefront within Boston and across the nation. Going back to the Black Lives Matter movement that had happened last year, it's still prevalent and relevant to this day. And specifically, there have been protests throughout Boston. I've participated in many of them, and one of them being a protest in pushing to rename Faneuil Hall, with the history of behind it of slavery. And so just would love to hear your stance on that push to renaming Faneuil Hall and where you stand with that.
Thank you so much for your leadership and taking on that role with student government. For me as an Asian American woman, it's been a really difficult last couple of weeks, and just to see what it takes to elevate issues that have always been there. And I think that is true with the pandemic and almost every issue, almost every crisis that we're talking about now. was clear and obvious to so many residents of color, and particularly Black and Brown residents. But now we're in a moment where we hopefully will continue to be forced to confront the racial injustices and the inequities that we have seen. The legacy, I want to acknowledge being part of the most diverse candidate field for mayor in the city's history. And what an incredible moment it is right now for the city to be celebrating for the first time the leadership of our first Black mayor, our first woman mayor, Kim Janey, my colleague who is acting mayor, serving in this role of mayor for the next 7 months. And across the entire candidate field, for each one of us, the issues and solutions for racial justice, for Black and Brown residents need to be at the forefront. I think Faneuil Hall is part of a long list of conversations that we need to have in the city about how we have memorialized, how we've told the story of our history. Boston has a very particular reputation nationally. We have never confronted fully the legacy of racism through our own city structures that led to such an open and hateful display through court-ordered school desegregation. And Faneuil Hall represents the centuries before the racial injustices that were happening here. I think for me, I've led a push over several years to be very intentional about monuments, memorials, and place names. We are a city that is home to activism on civil rights, abolition, marriage equality, on so many different issues and so many instances of leading the way across the country. And yet, when you look at whose names are on the buildings and who's, how many statues there are representing different communities, it is very disproportionate. You can't even many communities are not represented at all whatsoever. And so I completely support the process of engaging community around having these conversations. I think with Faneuil Hall in particular, we have to do more than talk about a name change, though. It has to be aligned with efforts for restorative justice, for to have a conversation about reparations, to have the conversation about how the city overall, not just sort of silo by silo or one building and then another building, how we reconcile our 400 years of history and how special that is with the need to make sure that that reflects every part of our history and the communities who are building Boston still today. So I have certainly worked with the organizers and the advocates who have been pushing for a name change and eager to keep engaging on that. I want to make sure that we are talking not just about changing names, but also the very important work of equity in city contracting and closing the racial wealth gap across Boston and ensuring that our educational system and our transit system truly reflect justice all throughout. So it's part of I think a more comprehensive conversation, but really appreciate the advocacy and believe that it's important in this moment.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilor Wu, for that awesome answer. And racial justice is so important to us at UMB and everyone in our generation, hopefully everyone in our society. So I'm glad we got to ask you a question about that. So the next person we have on the docket today to ask a question is, as John Ray already said, our awesome student body vice president, although that vice is almost a formality because they work so much as a team to get so much done for our university, Jaylee Pereira. So I'll pass the floor to Jaylee to ask her question.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nick. Hi. Hello, Councilor Wu. So great to see you here today. And just thank you for sharing your story as well, of how you grew up and especially with your family. As I know, similar story resonates with a lot of Asian Americans in the community. So on that question, my question is more towards, especially with everything that's been happening over the past year, but obviously going back hundreds of years, or 100 years, to everything that's kind of happened with the Asian American community. How, if you are elected as mayor, how would you support the Asian American community in Boston, and how would you support initiatives such as Boston's Little Saigon in Dorchester?
Thank you so much, and really excited to see you as part of the leadership team too, at the university. I think in processing what has been happening, and certainly after the just senseless shootings in Atlanta, we've had several conversations and community spaces within the Asian American community in Boston locally and across Massachusetts. And in fact, I was just earlier on a town hall that several organizations were leading on anti-Asian racism. And I think, there are so many members of our community and the AAPI community who have been told and raised, as I was, this is, you're always going to stick out. You're always going to, experience some degree of racism and discrimination. But what you should do about it is just keep your head down and work harder, right? Try to just stay out of trouble. Don't stick your neck out. And that was very much reinforced throughout my childhood. And I think we have seen, in some ways related to that or reinforced and certainly intertwined with that, a repeated history in this country of the Asian American community and various sub-communities experiencing scapegoating, othering, violence, and this perpetual foreigner status, right? How many Asian Americans have been asked over and over again in our lives, even if you were born here, right? Where are you really from, right? Where are you from? And I think we're at a point now, at least in the local community, where people have said enough is enough about not speaking out. And there's a moment for true community building and engagement. I think there are two pieces that I've been feeling are really important, especially in the context of the anti-Asian racism and violence. One is to really ensure that we're sharing the history of this community in the United States. There of course are many more recent immigrants who identify as Asian Americans, but there are Asian Americans who are many generations of in this country, right? And yet, from the Chinese Exclusion Act to the internment of Japanese Americans to post 9/11 racism and xenophobia, Vincent Chin, and racial tensions related to changes in the economy, and of course our former president's fueling of xenophobia and racism with this pandemic. It's been a cycle that feels very, very familiar. And so I think what I hope to do in my small part of having a platform is to just ensure that we are creating space for that voice to be heard, to be recognized, to be visible. There's so many news articles where API numbers are always left out of the list, right? You hear every other group's numbers. There's such a wide gap in representation, particularly in industries that are more sort of public and visible in the mainstream, like entertainment, government and politics, business. And so really leaning in and celebrating, lifting up those voices, but even more importantly, making sure to do whatever I can do to build infrastructure between communities. Because as long as any community is being threatened and harmed and facing just racism, all of us are. And as long as any community is feeling isolated in that incidence, we won't get to the point where we're actually creating racial justice for everyone. And so it's really important right now to think about how our communities can build together, to stand side by side, to make sure that we are just as vocal on ending racism across our communities in times of crisis as we are when it's the moments after the cameras are no longer on, and when we are building, you know, the other 300 days of the year. And so I think most of all, Boston is a city whose story needs to be told differently, that we are a city that is a majority of people of color. We are a city that has so much richness in all the cultures that have shaped Boston. And we need the next mayor and the next city leadership to really bring and build multiracial, multi-generational, multilingual coalitions to tackle every single policy issue.
Thank you so much, Councilor Wu, for that awesome answer. It's been something we've been talking about a lot on campus lately, given the tragic events that occurred in Atlanta over the last week, and obviously this long history that you talked about of horrible anti-Asian American and Pacific Islander violence. So next, I'd like to turn to an issue that has been kind of swept under the rug, at least I feel like, since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and that's climate change. So I invite the floor to Isabella Pereira, who I have talked to many times on this specific issue, and I know has an amazing grasp of the issue. So thank you, Isabella. Without further ado, the floor is yours.
First of all, I hope you the very best on your mayoral campaign this year.
Thank you.
So my first question is, what are your views in terms of the climate bill, which Governor Baker subsequently denied? Do you think that climate change and global warming should be a main concern that legislatures and other Boston, Massachusetts government officials should be focusing on?
So yes, I'm so excited about this question too. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the governor just signed the sort of revised version of it, but it was shocking when he vetoed it the first time around, because the bill itself, you know, huge step forward, wonderful to see, but does not get us nearly to where we need to be anyway. And so this was meant to really be one step in much, much more progress. And the fact that it even got held up and had to restart and pass through again was incredibly frustrating. Climate is the issue that I worry about most for my boys, as I'm thinking about the life and the world that they will have, and you know, when they're grown-ups and part of their own families. Boston is so vulnerable as a city. We are one of the, you know, we're in one of the 6 regions of the world that was called out in the United Nations 2018 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. This was this huge international effort, thousands of studies compiled and scientists from all across the world, 700 pages. And if you read through it, you know, it was shocking. I remember seeing that and just to realize that we were so, not only is it that we see this flooding and here, but really we are accelerating beyond the average of the warming that's already happened around the world. We're very vulnerable because of Boston's history as well. So much of the downtown and parts of the coastal city were originally not land. It's built on human-made landfill. Boston used to have much higher hills, and these were cut down and leveled, and all that dirt was dumped in to artificially build out land, right? The Back Bay actually used to be a bay. And so because that land is artificial, it is much lower. And Mother Nature is going to take it right back as the water keeps coming back up. So we have an even shorter window to act in Boston compared to other parts of the world. And the beauty of the Green New Deal and so many of the organizing efforts around climate justice today is that it recognizes that this is not just about escaping the harms of climate change, right? The risks that will come and the flooding and the heat and the storms. This is about recognizing that the very same steps we have to take to deal with climate change are the same steps as would eliminate poverty, right? And bring about racial equity. So this is an opportunity for Boston and for cities around the world to really lean in and bring great jobs, invest in healthy homes, reduce air pollution, make sure we have clean water, improve every part of living in our community, right? Connect people to transportation that is reliable and free and electric, or mass transit as a community space. So there's so much good that should come out of this, but we just need to move a lot faster on it. I'm proud to be the first office to put forward a city level Green New Deal anywhere in the country. Shout out to our lead author, Nina Schlegel, who worked for a year and a half to make sure that we were working with the knowledge from local organizing groups, as well as the national federal authors of the National Green New Deal, to be able to put 15 policy recommendations forward for the city of Boston. This is a blueprint or a roadmap for how any city across the country could begin to uniquely tackle climate change locally. And it's also about recognizing that climate justice is racial and economic justice, right? We can invest in local, high-paying, great jobs. We can secure people's homes and make sure that they're flood proof, and that the utilities bills are non-existent because they're so energy efficient. There's so many ways in which addressing all the issues in an intersectional way leads to outcomes that are also intersectional and also address all of these concerns at once.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
And that's such a, thank you, Isabella, for asking that question. It's so pertinent to obviously us, as we're the generation that'll be seeing these consequences for 60 years from now. So I'm so excited to hear you talk about your policies on that. So for our next question, we're going to talk about an issue that has affected especially New England and a lot of other areas around the country, and that's the opioid crisis. I'll ask Isamar to unmute herself and take the floor to ask her question. Thank you, Isamar.
Hi, Councilor Wu. I just wanted to thank you for being here and everything you've done in the city for especially people of color. When you introduced yourself, you said that the city of Boston has given you a lot of things that you cherish, and that even though you were not lucky enough to be born here, I wasn't either. And this city has given me a lot of opportunities to progress. And I'm very worried about people on Mass Ave who are, suffering due to this opioid crisis. And a lot of people don't take into account that there is a mental health aspect to it too. So I was just wondering, what sort of ideas do you have in mind to help these people?
Yeah, what has been happening? Okay, let me back up and say the very first thing that I did on the city council when I started in 2014 was to go and visit every single one of the city's emergency shelters. And this was at the top of my list because I had spent my campaign just trying to meet as many people as possible. I was a first-time candidate. No one had any idea who I was. And so I had to go to where the people were. So we were at tea stations, we were at public parks and other spaces where there's a lot of foot traffic. And I would end up having some long and really detailed conversations with residents experiencing homelessness about how hard it was to have their health maintained in that situation, how hard it was to navigate the shelter system, and just how far we were in terms of people having a way to get onto a more stable pathway. So I did that, and one of the places that I visited early on was the emergency shelter on Long Island, which is an island owned by the land is the city of Boston's property, but the only way to get there had been a bridge from Quincy that eventually a couple weeks after I visited was taken down because it was so old and determined to be structurally unsound. All of the people living on the island, seeking shelter on the island, in a span of 30 minutes were evacuated, and there was no plan of what would happen to all the programs at that point, all the services. It was an incredibly destabilizing event that 7 years later, we are still really seeing the impacts of. And I think we often talk about the issue, we describe it as a Mass and Cass issue because in the 1 mile radius around Mass Ave and Melnia Cass Boulevard, that is where all of the medication assisted treatment for opiates are. That is where multiple of the largest emergency overnight shelters are. But we can't think of it as just a problem of one part of the city. This is about a citywide issue with opiates, as you're saying, with homelessness. And we have to start treating it from a citywide resource perspective. I've spent a lot of time talking to doctors who treat patients in that area, small businesses who are in the area, neighbors, all different stakeholder groups. And the reality is that, one, we need to increase access to treatment. There's been a lot of stigma that has informed how and where we've set up treatment. One is that we have required people to come in every single day to get their treatment, when fearing the chance that if people had that medication at home, it would be sold on the black market or cause overdoses, etc. But the reality is that during the pandemic, as those rules were changed because of public safety and the public health crisis, to allow for longer take-home periods of medication, to allow for more telehealth, to check in with your doctor and stay on track, it has been a huge change and a lot of benefit from giving people the dignity of being able to have more say over their lives, not have to drag themselves down to one part of the city, pay for transportation, try to work that into the schedule, get stuck in traffic every day after every day. But what the providers say is that, treatment aside, even when patients get into a treatment program, do really well in that, as long as they still don't have a stable home to go back to, as long as they're still experiencing homelessness and don't have a way to get a job or think about a more stable way to construct a life, it becomes a cycle of falling back into the opiate crisis anyway. So there is a tremendous mental health and trauma supports need. Most of all, there's a need to have a public health and a housing lens when it comes to addressing this issue.
Thank you so much for answering my question.
Thank you so much, Counselor, and thank you for that great question, Isamar. That's really an issue that I don't know that there's a person in this whole entire state that hasn't touched personally. So it's great to hear your thoughts on how we can help the city of Boston get through this terrible crisis. So now we're going to head on to one of my favorite issues to talk about, and that's public transit. I was really excited to see this question come in through the chat a second ago. So without further ado, I will allow Richard Lee to ask his question on the T.
Hi, Councilor Wu. Thanks so much for being here. I did want to ask about the T because I feel like that is an issue that has been around kind of forever, that has remained stagnant for years and years and years. As you're probably aware, the MBTA announced a couple of weeks ago that it was cutting service despite receiving $1 billion new in funding from the latest COVID relief bill. A lot of Massachusetts delegates and advocates and officials have since called on the MBTA to reverse its service cuts and expand service. I was just wondering, in your experiences as a city councilor and in your plans as mayor, how have you held and how do you plan on holding the MBTA accountable when it feels like every year they're raising and jacking up fares while not really improving service overall?
That's right. And you all, or I'll say the UMass community, UMass Boston community has been especially impacted in recent years as the site of the major red line derailment and just the awful service that had to happen for months after that, while everything was being reconstructed. So this issue is incredibly personal to me. When I had my second son, my boys are 2.5 years apart. And so there was a period of time when both of them were going to childcare at City Hall. And so I would leave our home in Rosendale with a big double stroller with both of them packed in there and wrapped up, and had to go by bus and then elevator and then other elevator to the train and then more elevators everywhere. And so I've seen just how much the service has gotten worse over the last couple decades in Boston and Massachusetts. The T, in fact, is really the primary way that I felt connected and fell in love with Boston to begin with when I was at Harvard, and coming over the Red Line to Chinatown every single weekend, and just feeling the freedom to be able to go check out all different parts of the city on, with the, at that time, much more affordable coin that you used to put into the machine to get on. And we've seen just a lack of investment, lack of maintaining the infrastructure. And then, as you say, the fares going up and up and up. I've been part of a mass effort to organize protests across the entire MBTA system, the year of the derailment, the year that they raised fares yet again, because that marked a 41% increase in T prices since 2012. When you look at the gas tax, which had barely gone up at all, you look at various funding sources. And so this was putting the burden of mobility and the most environmentally responsible decision and the best decision for reducing traffic. And yet the very riders who were doing that were being punished and forced to bear the burden of paying for the service. And so I've been pushing for fare-free transportation for a very long time. I'm one of the folks that shows up at FMCB, Fiscal and Management Control Board meetings at the T on a fairly frequent basis, because when the city speaks up, it makes a difference. When the mayor of Boston makes a statement that this is unacceptable, what's happening, there is always some pressure to change it or to find a different way. And the service cuts that you mentioned, especially after news of the $1 billion the T received, when the congressional delegation all spoke up and said, this is unacceptable, that we got you federal money and you are raising fares, the T did end up walking pieces of that back. And they said they basically took back the layoffs that they were going to implement, and they are accelerating the restoration of some of the service. So, fundamentally, we need to have not just progressive city leadership, but also progressive state leadership. And so we will be focusing on 2022 and the governor's race after we get through this year. But even just the city level, there's so much that Boston could be doing. The city of Boston is entirely in control of the street space, right? So we decide how fast buses can go on our streets by making choices about whether there's a dedicated lane that is reserved for buses, about whether there's traffic signalization, that technology that recognizes when a bus or green line is coming to give that bus priority, how we make decisions about whether we're piloting free fares like other cities have done. In Lawrence, the mayor on his own worked with their local regional transit authority to make all of their bus routes through Lawrence free for 2 years. And that has transformed people's lives. And so there's a lot we can do just in terms of accountability and using that bully pulpit to advocate, to be clear about the urgency of issues that affect city residents. But there's a whole lot we can do directly too, especially in making bus service faster, more reliable, and to pilot fare free service on several bus lines as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Counselor, for that awesome answer. I love hearing about fare free tea, not just because it would save me a whole boatload of money, but because it would also save so many of my friends at UMass Boston a ton of money. I mean, being a commuter school, so many of our students depend on the tea to get from point A to point B. So it's awesome to hear from you on that. So our next question is actually going to come from my friend and one of my fellow College Democrats members, Bruno Ferreira, who's been working so hard to help get this event together. And I just want to give him a shout out, say I really appreciate him along with the rest of my officer board on how hard they've worked on putting this together. So it's related to working with the state on in order to help improve the city of Boston. So he's asking, in reaction to the governor's decision to continue contracting with McKinsey, the consulting firm that is partially responsible for boosting opioid companies' sales, how will you work with this Republican governor in a very progressive city, in a very progressive state, to help meet the challenges that the city is facing at the moment?
So, I mean, again, I'm just flagging this Republican governor's term is up in 2022, and much of that year will be about the campaign. So, you know, I will do whatever it takes to fight for Bostonians and to fight for my constituents. I will work with whoever is in any positions to help, and we will make it happen. But I also will not be shy about using the responsibility and the platforms that we have at the city level to call out when things are not moving fast enough or not moving in the right direction. And I think sometimes we've seen a culture of sort of covering for, you know, whether it's to just promote a show of bipartisanship or to avoid, you know, embarrassing other people or making conflict. But the longer that a different way I should say this is, we can't operate at the speed of political cycles. We have to operate at the urgency of what our families need, right? Sometimes just to put it in perspective, my older son, Blaze, was born in my first year on the council. He is now 6. And it's been basically the span of one of 2 mayoral terms, right? Because Marty Walsh and I were elected in the same year. And so Blaze was born the first year that we were both in office. 2 mayoral terms later, he went from just opening his eyes to the world to being in kindergarten. 2 more mayoral terms, and he will be in high school. And we can't wait to say, okay, you know, let's get past this election, then we'll talk about how to study, how to begin doing it. This is about delivering the urgency and the scale of progress that our residents deserve, that our residents have been advocating for and fighting for. And we need the state to be part of that as well. And so I will make sure that the infrastructure that we're building now feeds right into advocating for progressive leadership at the state level in the next election cycle, and along the way to use the fullest of the platform that we have at the city level to push for what we need. And the other thing I'll mention is that I think sometimes we think about it as, you know, a one-way street, right? That the city has to do things a certain way, otherwise the state will not respond in kind or this or that. But we have strength in numbers as well. Right? There are so many cities across Massachusetts that are going through the same challenges and need the same types of relief from the state or changes in policy. And each one of us going up through our own delegation to try to advocate for change can be easily batted down. But when we start to organize city to city and all go together, I think that creates a very different dynamic as well.
Thank you so much for answering Bruno's question there. He had some mic issues, so that's why I asked the question for him. Now I see we're coming short on time, so I obviously want to make sure I get my own question in. So my question was, and I thought there was a good segue there talking about other officials in city government. with Mayor Marty Walsh leaving the city of Boston to go become Secretary of Labor, I think it's an awesome time to talk about organized labor and how the city can work with our unions and continue to work with our unions, as that was such a big issue for the previous mayor. So me personally, I am a big supporter of unions. I love hearing about unionization. I'm a basic Democrat on that. But what I would like to hear from you is how can you as Mayor of Boston work with our city's many and vibrant unions to help work with the city and improve the city as much as we can? And how can the city of Boston work to increase unionization and make sure that workers' rights are respected?
Thank you so much for this question. I share your views on unions and have been a part of many a picket line, and always eager to back up our union members in major, whether it's an organizing drive or a strike or an effort to draw light to injustices that are happening. Unions have delivered so many of the basic workers' protections that we take for granted in this country. And we need to get back to a place in our history where we are building up unions rather than seeing them weakened. And so I'm hopeful that with Mayor Walsh and his new post and with this new administration, we can turn the tide on so much of the damage that has been done from the last federal administration to workers and to unions. You often think about unions and labor as a federal and a state issue, but there is a lot that cities can do as well. One of the very first ordinances that I worked on was a wage theft ordinance to hold any employers accountable who wanted to do business with the city for past violations related to wage theft or safety. We have seen the need for that even very recently with the preventable and awful deaths that have happened at construction sites, work sites across the city, when the companies there had a documented history of safety violations. And so the city, with whatever tools we have, needs to ensure that we are creating safe working environments and using the tools at our disposal for fair wages and benefits and good working conditions, and where possible to legislate that. One of the ordinances that I'm proudest of is my push to make sure that whenever we spend money on food in Boston, that money is being invested in the community and multiplies in its value. And so we passed a good food purchasing ordinance, becoming the first city on the East Coast to do this. We follow the 5 categories that other cities have as well in requirements to ensure that any food is locally produced where possible, is environmentally sustainable in terms of the production practices, that there are fair wages and union labor all along the food supply chain, humane animal welfare treatment, and healthy and nutritious. And Boston became the first city in the country to add a 6th category of racial equity to our analysis as well, so that any of the vendors or sub-vendors, we want to give preference to businesses owned by people of color. So this is $18 million of purchasing power for Boston through our schools. If we partnered with all other industries to do this kind of analysis, we would have a tremendous impact in standing up good local jobs and making sure that we are growing the pool of workers who can be members of unions, and that there are guaranteed ways for that, for our local spending to be connected to that in our local economy. And then I think the other point I'll make is that there are a lot of pieces related to labor that are floating around, managed by all different city departments. I am fully supportive and eager to put forward some plans around how to have a centralized one-stop shop, so that we are connecting all the issues related to wages, hours, working conditions, and for the city to be proactively taking the lead on that.
Thank you so much, Councilor, for answering that question. Obviously, with the Biden administration going in, that was a big part of his campaign. So it's awesome to hear your thoughts on that subject. All right, so this is going to be our last student question coming up here, and then I'll give you a chance to make whatever closing remarks you'd like to, and then I'd like to recognize a couple people who made this event possible. So without further ado, we're going to go back to a familiar face, our Vice President Jaylee Pereira, who asked another awesome question in the chat. Thank you, Jaylee.
Thank you so much, Nick. This is definitely a joint question from John Ray and I, both very curious about this. My half-sister is a middle school, elementary school teacher in Dorchester, and we're both very passionate about the school system. So our question to you is, how do you plan to support Boston Public School teachers as well as students if you are elected mayor?
I'm so excited about being able to dig in on really transforming our Boston Public Schools and creating the value and the priority for public education that I think we've fallen really far short on. I am now in my second round of being a BPS mom, having raised my sister as her legal guardian, and now with my own boys in one in kindergarten, the other in the lottery to hopefully get into pre-K. And what we know is that there's just huge disparities across our district, right? Resources concentrated in a small number of schools, and then thousands of students who are in buildings without bathrooms that they feel comfortable using, right? Only 30 some of our 125 school buildings have modern HVAC systems where you can regulate the heat and ventilation properly. And so you really get the sense as you're walking into each one of these school buildings, as I've visited all the high schools in Boston Public Schools, how much students feel valued and how much they feel let down. So my belief is that we've been talking about education and all the gaps in our system for a long, long time in Boston. We have study after study, report after report, documenting all the ways that we've fallen short. And we keep trying to put forward new initiatives that do some little thing here or pilot this thing here. We need to have a new approach across the board. We need stability in the district, first of all. We're on our 5th superintendent in 7 years, and that's just no way to run any organization. We are a district where the gaps between which schools have social and emotional supports versus after school it's all concentrated. And we're a city with tremendous resources that are just not connecting to our schools. So I'm proposing a whole child community schools approach, which would break down the silos that are currently between our communities, but also rethink how we devote resources to our families. Rather than Boston Public Schools taking on the whole burden of trying to solve everything related to poverty, basically, that our families are dealing with, we want to put the full force of city resources together with a youth cabinet that links the Office of Housing Stability, Office of Immigrant Advancement, the after-school programs, the Department of Innovation and Technology to tackle the digital divide. Any department that has resources that our families needs to be in communication on a regular basis, specifically focused on young people in our city. We also need to have a connection point for each family. So we are proposing a family navigator to guide each student from the moment they enter Boston Public Schools all the way through when they graduate, to know the full range of what that family could use outside of academic supports. Is it that they need help paying for the heat to stay on? Is there a medical condition in the family and they need to be connected to resources or trauma supports or nutrition and food access? So the more that we begin to see schools as much more than just a place you go to learn, but entire community hub, I think the more we will be able to deliver those kind of intersectional resources as well.
Thank you so much, Councilor. Obviously, education is one of the biggest things that municipalities do in our country. So I'm so thankful to Jay Lee for asking that question and getting some information from you about that specific subject. So now I understand you've got a busy schedule and we've got you through 7:30. So I'd like to give you a little bit of a chance to make some closing remarks. Just, I guess, say whatever you want. Maybe give us your final pitch here, and then I'll thank some of the people who made the event possible. Thank you, Councilor.
No, thank you for organizing and thank you for your leadership and civic engagement. I am so excited at what's going to happen for our city over the next decade, right? The decisions that we make in the next mayoral term and two truly will have ripple effects for generations to come as we are recovering from this pandemic. And in this moment of crisis, we need leadership that is bold, that is urgent, and most of all, that draws community in. And so I'm focused on making sure that we're building the organization and community in every neighborhood to be able to deliver change in office. But I want to just also remind folks of just how big of a gap there usually is when it comes to city elections. The turnout is incredibly low usually, and we see fewer than half of the number of people who go to vote for president and governor usually come vote for mayor. And we want to make sure that this election and how important it is really reflects the full scope of Boston residents' preferences, our views, our dreams, our hopes, our struggles. And so we need your help. The only way to get turnout up is to go voter by voter, family by family, to have conversations out in the community. The pandemic certainly makes that difficult, but we are working to meet people where they're at, virtually, in person, socially distanced safely, and we will have more options, I think, as we continue to push for an equitable and urgent vaccination rollout to be able to end this pandemic. And so would be so excited to have your support, very, very respectfully ask for your vote in the September elections and in the November election. And if you are looking to join a team that is focused on the future of the city and empowering every community part of that, we would love to have you come volunteer with us.
Thank you so much, Councilor, for giving us your time. It means so much to us that you'd come and speak to us students, are an often ignored population, but it's so great to see you coming and talking to us on such important issues. I'd also like to thank all of you who asked questions, Isabel, John Ray, Jay Lee, Isabella, Isamar, Richard, Bruno. Thank you guys for coming up with such great questions and really getting a diverse range of issues on the table here. I think it kind of really helps to give us, when we have that diverse range of issues, a good indication of who the candidate is and why we should go out and vote for them. So I'd also like to thank the people who work so hard to make this event a reality. My Vice President, Fareen Khan, my Treasurer, Claire Sparadolosi, my Secretary, Ashley Pierce, and my Communications Director, Bruno Ferreira, and several other members who worked really hard. The aforementioned Isabella Ferreira, Isabella de Medeiros, and so many more people who worked so hard to make this event a reality. And also thank you to our student body president and vice president, John Ray and Jay Lee, for coming to our event today. I'm so thankful to all of you who came with such great questions and to listen to this awesome candidate speak. And thank you guys so much. I'm going to turn off the recording